Hello and welcome to the Tennessee Informer. Today we have a very special show planned for you today. Our topic for today is Civil War General Nathan Bedford Forrest, his life before, during, and after the war, including a lot of the myths and lies that have been told about him since then. We will provide documented truths about what he actually did. Then we'll also talk about Abraham Lincoln's famous Emancipation Proclamation. We'll be talking about what it did and what it didn't do, and there's a lot. Our guests today are Rick Revel, otherwise known as Mr. History, and Gene Andrews, the caretaker of Nathan Bedford Forrest's actual boyhood home. You don't want to miss this, so don't go anywhere.
'Dixieland, in Dixieland, where I was born in early on one frosty morning. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland. And I wish I was in Dixie, hooray, hooray, in Dixieland, it's my turn to live and die in Dixie. Away, away, away down south in Dixie, away, away, away down south in Dixie.
Years after the Mexican War, many of those same West Point officers would answer the call of duty once again. Political differences so divided our nation that a war between the states was inevitable. Brother against brother, North against South. One of the greatest military geniuses of all times had no formal training, yet he rose from the rank of a private to lieutenant general. His name was Nathan Bedford Forrest.
That devil Forrest must be hunted down and killed if it costs 10,000 lives and bankrupts the federal treasury.
On the day after the Battle of Shiloh, the rebels were falling back real slow. No William Tecumseh Sherman with 3 brigades of men thought he might attack those rebels once again. You know he wants to fight. He's about to get one. There's one man that stood in Sherman's way. He said, Yankee, this just ain't your day. Oh, Nathan Bedford Forrest, 300 by his side, said, boys, it's time to ride. Come ride with the devil, for your sins, Yankee, will pay. Come ride with the devil is riding your way. Now Forrest, he shouted from all the hill, said, boys, give him hot lead and cold steel. And he gave his rebel yell, then he led the charge. That's when old Sherman, he swallowed hard. Look real close, I think he broke out in a cold sweat. Said, men, run that devil down. He's coming after me, so stand your ground. But fear took control, the Yankees did run. The devil's work on this day's done. Yeah, come ride with the devil, for your sins, Yankee, will pay. Come ride Ride with the devil. The devil is riding you. Come ride. Ride with the devil. For your sins, Yankee will pay. Come ride. Ride with the devil. The devil is riding you. Oh, the devil is riding you. Oh, the devil is riding your
Wow, great video. I think I recognize that voice in there, Rick.
Well, it might be me.
Might be you.
Just might be.
When did you write that?
Oh, Lord, that song's 20 years old.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I wrote that many years ago when we were doing a lot of Civil War reenactments. That's a good friend of mine, Stan Dalton, playing Forrest. And John Rawl actually shot a lot of that footage early on, back in the early 2000s. He shot that footage at a reenactment that I was doing the announcement and doing the announcement work for it and actually singing at the event. And we got together after he shot a documentary, and he heard my song and said, could I put that song on the documentary? So then I asked in turn for the permission to do a music video of some of the footage.
Okay.
So yeah, but it's a great video. It shows kind of what Forrest was during the war and why the Union Army feared him so much.
Right. And why they called him the devil.
And why they called him the devil. That was a term they gave him. Yes,
Right,
sir.
right. So you're an author, historian, reenactor, award-winning musician. I can't cover everything. So if everybody wants to know everything about you, they have to go to rickrevel.com.
Yes, sir.
And so you said you did this one about 20 years ago?
Probably.
Or you did the song?
in the early 2000s. Yeah.
Wow.
So
Okay. I've
been around
never
a while.
seen it.
It's been around a while. It's been on YouTube, and it's got about 12,000 views. So for an older song, it's done pretty good.
Well, that might get a few more now.
It might. It
Good.
just might.
Hope so. So we don't go down too far down the road without bringing in somebody else who's
Yes.
pretty well versed on Forrest, and that would be Gene Andrews. He's the caretaker of the Forrest home. How you doing today, Gene?
Doing great. Thank you very much for having me on. It's an honor to be with y'all. And I certainly enjoyed that video with Stan Dalton. He's been at our Forrest Homecoming event for a number of years. And he really looks like Forrest. And he's a great horseman, too.
Yes.
So he was a great addition to have out there.
He looks familiar. I think he was at a reenactment in Fort Donelson at the 150th anniversary.
May have been.
I think that's him. I'd like to get him on the show sometime.
Oh, Stan's excellent. He is.
So, Gene, it says you were born and raised in Nashville and served as a first lieutenant with the 3rd Marine Division in Vietnam. You played a little bit of football. You played for the Quantico Marines football team, and you had a tryout with the Cincinnati Bengals. So what position did you play?
I was wide receiver. Now, that was about 40 pounds and 2 good knees ago. That was a long time ago.
Also known as years and beers ago, right? So you taught history and coached football and track for 2 high schools in Nashville. Worked with your brother Don in a motorsports medical program in IndyCar, NASCAR, and the American Le Mans Racing Series for 25 years. You're retired now, but you work almost full-time as the caretaker for the Nathan Bedford Forrest Boyhood home near Chapel Hill, Tennessee.
Yes, sir.
How did you come?
I need to get an 8 to 5 job so I can slack off a little bit. I think.
and maybe get a day off, get a vacation. So how did you end up working at the Bedford home?
Well, I've been a member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans since 1988. And when I started going down to the home there and just trying to help the gentleman across the road, Powell Ogilvy, maintain the home. The state of Tennessee had it at one time. In 1972, they bought that house and 49 acres out there, and they were going to fix it up as a satellite park of Henry Horton State Park. And then political correctness reared its ugly head, and it was just abandoned. And it didn't look anything like that picture. There were weeds growing up around it, and wasn't even a front porch. And so, in 1997, the state of Tennessee gave it to the Sons of Confederate Veterans. and we've been working on it ever since. So they just needed somebody that lived close by that could go down there and sort of help coordinate the reconstruction project of that home out there.
Well, I'm glad they've been able to restore it, and I appreciate all you do on that. And I appreciate both of you coming on the show today to talk about Forrest and other things. I think we could everybody here agree that he was one of the greatest military leaders that our country ever produced.
Yeah.
And it's a shame and he had no formal training. I mean, it's not like he went to West Point. It's not like he even did a few years in the military.
Right.
But he was just a natural.
And you mentioned about one of the greatest. There's those that will disagree with us because of the side that he took.
Right.
But a lot of the Union generals around the campfire would say, what do we do about this guy? Because all their West Point tactics and everything, it just didn't work on Forrest. Forrest used a whole different tactic.
Right. Well, you in the video, Sherman is talking about Forrest, and we've got to get him no matter what it costs.
Yep. That's right.
And I'm pretty sure he was a West Pointer. I know he was at least a Mexican War veteran.
That's right.
So he definitely had their attention.
He did.
And let's talk about maybe one of the first battles where he really kind of showed his abilities.
You want to take that one, Gene, at Sacramento? Which one are you going to take?
Well, started out in December of 1861 up at Sacramento, Kentucky.
Yep.
And he didn't wait for the Federal Army to come after him. He went after them. And that was pretty much his tactic throughout the rest of the war. That, of course, his famous quote was, "Never stand to receive the attack of the enemy. Always take the initiative and get there first with the most men." And that's probably one of the most simple military maxims of all time, but it's also one of the most misquoted. Forrest never said, "Get there firstest with the mostest." But our South-hating and Forrest-hating enemies will never let us hear the lastest of that, as Author Robert Henry said in his book. So that was his tactic, and I think that's why he was so great. He wasn't trained to think like the rest of the West Pointers did. And in his book, Dr. Samuel Mitchum said, in the Western theater of the war, the West Point professionally trained generals hardly ever won, while Forrest, the amateur, hardly ever lost. And I think that was pretty much summed it up.
Can I add to that, Gene?
By their tactics.
Can I add to it?
Fire away.
Okay. A lot of people say, how did he wind up in Sacramento, Kentucky? If you look at the map, that's pretty good distance up Kentucky. And he starts out in Memphis, Tennessee. He starts out as a private. How does he wind up as a lieutenant colonel in Kentucky?
Right.
What's the mission? Now he's advanced from being a private. He's a lieutenant colonel. The governor of Tennessee has a lot to do with that. So he's now a lieutenant colonel forming a cavalry unit. He needs weapons.
Right.
He needs a way to get sabers, pistols, carbines. Everybody's got squirrel rifles and rocks to throw at the enemy. So they ride literally to Louisville, Kentucky. With his own money, he buys the weaponry for his men. So on the way back from Louisville, they come in through Sacramento, and that's kind of how the battle takes place.
Oh, okay.
So he's trying to weaponize his men, get them the weapons they need to fight the war.
Now, he didn't come from money. He did make a lot of money on his own, and a lot of it was the slave business, but all the same. The fact that he would just enlist as a private, because a lot of the people at that time, based on their situation in the community, right. Oh, well, I don't want to be anything less than lieutenant colonel or anything less than, at least a captain. But this guy, pretty humble, enlisted to be a private.
At Camp Randolph or Rudolph, or however you want to say it.
And by the time the war, he grew up on the frontier, and it was a tough life.
Yep.
And they moved down to northern Mississippi, and when he was 16 years old, his father died. So at 16, he was the male head of a household of a widowed mother and 5 other children. So he had to do everything to keep the family from starving to death, and went into business with his uncle in Hernando. And by the time the war started, he was worth well over $1.5 million, which today would be about 40 to 45 million. And just like y'all said, he didn't demand to get a high political office or a high rank in the military just because of his wealth and standing. So you're right. At 40 years old, he went in and enlisted as a private in the Confederate Army. And I'm sure they gave him a hard time about being pops or grandpa or something like that.
But not for too long.
Teenagers did. They didn't call him that very long, though. I'll guarantee you that.
And one of the first men.
Yeah, Governor Harris, Governor Isaac G. Harris knew him. They were acquaintances before the war. So just like Rick said, Governor Harris asked him to raise a mounted battalion and raised him up to the rank of lieutenant colonel.
And one of the first people that he would kill is when he was working with his uncle. They're around Hernando. A scuffle takes place, or a fight. It's actually over the ownership. I think it was of a slave, but there was a fight that broke out, and in the defense of his uncle, Forrest steps in and kills one of his first men at that time. It was, I believe it was a knife fight, wasn't it? Fist in a knife fight.
His uncle had a feud with the Matlock brothers.
And
one Saturday afternoon, they were coming up the street there in Hernando, and one of the brothers pulled out a pistol and shot his uncle dead right there in the street. And Bedford pulled out a pistol and shot him, and then the other Matlock brother was going for a gun, and Bedford's pistol jammed, and people were standing around watching. I guess that's what you did on a boring Saturday afternoon in Hernando. There wasn't any football games to watch. So somebody pitched him a Bowie knife.
Yep, that's what it was.
And he went after that other brother and the overseer with a Bowie knife.
Yep.
And ran them off. That overseer said, they're not paying me enough to go take on this wild teenager. And he took off. So Forrest was arrested and brought before the magistrate, and then, it was self-defense, so they released him after that. But that's the kind of life he grew up in.
And
so
the reason
fighting a war was really not that big a deal.
Right.
After going
and that's
through
the
all
reason for bringing that story up, so you would know that he knew how to handle himself before the war. So it wasn't the fact that he had enlisted as a private just saying what's going to happen. He already knew it was going to be a tough fight because he was a tough fighter to begin with.
Yes, sir.
So you mentioned, when I asked the question about what made him, where he kind of started to gain his fame, you mentioned Sacramento, and I think you had another one in mind, another battle.
Well, Sacramento, but from Sacramento, he did a few things up near Aurora, Kentucky, and the river, the Cumberland River and all that. His group actually had a little 3-pounder artillery piece, and they fired upon a couple of our tin-clads, as we called them, some of the wooden gunboats. So they actually exchanged fire there. And these things took place before Fort Donelson. So Fort Donelson becomes more of his major battle. Sacramento's more of a skirmish, although it was a pretty good, intense little battle. But Fort Donelson be his first time that he really starts making a name for himself. He was the one that led the escape out of Fort Donelson. And had it not been from him, then it'd been a total disaster. But he led about 700 men out of his own unit. Then some artillerymen followed him. Bushrod Johnson actually followed his escape route. So several got out. So it's possibly 1,500 to 2,000 followed Forrest out. So that kept it from being a total disaster there at Fort Donelson. But that's when he started making his name, that he didn't want to surrender. He didn't join the war to surrender.
Right. And of course, there was another, I think he tried to take Fort Donelson back maybe a year or so later.
That was with Wheeler. Yep, that was a Wheeler deal. You want to talk about that just a tad there, Gene, about Wheeler's debacle?
Well, that first time he was at Fort Donelson, he actually harassed Grant.
Yes.
After Fort Henry fell over on the Tennessee River, it was Forrest cavalry that harassed Grant when Grant was trying to march overland from the Tennessee to the Cumberland River at Dover. And so Forrest slowed them down and then got into the fort, and then the Confederates decided to break out on that morning of February 14th, and Forrest led the attack with the cavalry to capture prisoners, artillery. So now the Confederates had two options. They could get away to Clarksville and on to Nashville, or they could throw everybody into the attack. Grant's lines were already bent back in a sharp V, and throw everybody into the attack and drive them over the bluff and into the Cumberland River. And that's what Forrest wanted to do. But the West Point generals came up with a third option. They decided to turn around, march into the fort, and surrender. And that's what you were talking about, Rick.
Yep.
They called him that night and told him they were going to surrender. They didn't want his opinion. He was only a lieutenant colonel. And good night. He didn't go to West Point. He didn't know anything. But they were just telling him they're going to surrender. And he said, well, I didn't bring my men here to surrender.
Yeah. And if
they're
they
going
left
out here tonight, even if we have to bust hell wide open to do it.
That's it.
And he
and
did.
if they left him alone, during the time that they were doing the battle before Pillow pulls them all back in, the Orphan Brigade, between Forrest and the Orphan Brigade, they were pushing Wallace's men. They were pushing everybody back. So they had basically Grant's men on the rope. Had they just left the Orphan Brigade and left Forrest alone, I think the battle might have turned out different. But there's always that big if. But
And that was a more important battle than a lot of people realize.
yes, it was.
I mean,
So it was pretty much a turning point in the West.
yeah.
Yeah.
Things were in a lot of ways downhill after that in the West. So,
Well, I heard an interesting author say one time that every battle that was fought by the Army of Tennessee after Fort Donelson was an attempt to regain what the Confederates had lost at Fort Donelson.
Yes.
Because when that fell, that opened up Nashville. It opened up the Tennessee River all the way down to Muscle Shoals, Alabama. So if you look at it, the attempt to stop Grant at Pittsburgh Landing, the attempt to stop Buell and Rosecrans, the attempt by Hood to come back into Middle Tennessee late in the war, every campaign that the Confederates launched was a result of the loss at Fort Donelson and Fort Henry that opened up the rivers.
wow. So, all through the war, he's a thorn in their side.
Yes, sir.
They name him the devil.
Yes, sir.
And of course, one of the big things that we hear is the so-called Fort Pillow massacre, which if you read the congressional testimony after that, you if you bother to read that, then you realize that there was not a whole lot of truth in that whole massacre thing. But let's talk about that. We'll start with you on that, Gene.
Well, the so-called Fort Pillow massacre, not to be confused with the Alice's Restaurant massacre and Five Part Harmony. That really did happen. The Fort Pillow massacre didn't happen. So you got to get them separate. Anyway, that was war propaganda. And Winston Churchill said, the first casualty of war is the truth. And that was certainly what happened at Fort Pillow. Forrest Cavalry was on a raid into West Tennessee. They came up out of Columbus, Mississippi in March of 1864. They were going after horses in West Tennessee and Western Kentucky. They were on that raid for 5 weeks, and Fort Pillow was never mentioned. It wasn't in their operational orders. It wasn't on anything that happened during that raid. They got the horses for Abraham Buford's division. They were turned around, and they were coming out of Tennessee. They were headed back to Mississippi. And then on April the 4th, he sent a letter to his commanding officer in Mississippi, Stephen D. Lee, gave him a report how many prisoners they'd captured, how many miles of railroad track they'd torn up, et cetera, never mentioned Fort Pillow. On April the 6th, he sent a supplementary report, said, we will attend to Fort Pillow. So what happened? Well, the civilians in West Tennessee asked him to do something about Fort Pillow. The white and black soldiers were coming out of there, robbing the civilians, looting the homes, attacking the women, and Forrest was tough fighting enemy soldiers, but one thing you didn't do, you did not attack women. And that's what got him to send Chalmers and his division 60 miles out of the way to head over to take a fort on the Mississippi River. And everybody knows that cavalry can't attack a fort. And even if they captured it, what could they do with it? The Federal Navy would come down the river and blast them out of there. But the only reason they went was because of the civilians in West Tennessee wanted somebody to do something about the people that were murdering civilians and murdering Confederate prisoners that were caught behind enemy lines, then running back and hiding under the flag at Fort Pillow. So that's the only reason he went there.
Can I throw a name out there?
Yeah.
There's it's one of these, and Gene will back me on this probably. There's a lesser known name that unless you are an avid reader of Southern history and of the war, you're not going to know who Colonel Fielding Hurst. You're not going to know that name. But that Colonel Fielding Hurst lived not far from where the Battle of Shiloh takes place. He forms the 6th Tennessee U.S. Cavalry. All of his men, or it's called Hurst Nation. He actually had a place where he lived called Hurst Nation. And he is one of the group of people that's going out there, galvanized Southerners, and they go out and they're leading raids. And so as the people come to Forrest, the civilians that Gene was mentioning, a lot of that's Fielding Hurst men. They're going in and they're raiding. They actually went in to Jackson, Tennessee. They had stolen a lot of money The mayor of Jackson says, we want our money back. And so there's a discussion back and forth about all this money. And so he's basically holding the city on ransom, threatening to burn this town if he's not paid. He wants his money back. He's been sued for money, so Fieldinghurst wants his money back. The mayor says, give us 24 hours to try to raise some money. They wind up raising the money to pay Fieldinghurst, and Fieldinghurst winds up burning Jackson anyway, setting fire to Jackson, Tennessee.
Now he was from there. He was from that area.
He's from this area. He's
Right.
a Union officer. He has black slaves that ride with him,
Right.
and he's a Union officer.
Yeah.
And he was going into all these communities in West Tennessee, raiding them, stealing from the local people, killing some of the local people, because it's almost a Hatfield and McCoy type of situation. So he's killing people, and when Forrest comes through here, as Gene said, that's what's happening. They're saying, can you do something for us? And so Fort Pillow is basically a byproduct of their complaints. And some of those men were there. Some of the men that actually had ridden with Forrest at one time have now galvanized and are at Fort Pillow. Some of the white troopers, so there were white troopers, black troopers there. And then to top it off, 2 of the gunboats come down to the river during the battle under a white flag of truce as the Union Army is giving up, the Union troops are giving up. Forrest men are moving into the fort to take it over. Gunboats are coming down the river, so now the ones in the fort feel, we have a chance. So under the white flag, they begin to fire on Forrest men, and that was not good. So Forrest men get mad. Forrest, at this time, his horse had been shot out from under him. The horse had laid down on his leg, so it took a while for Forrest to get on another horse to come into Fort Pillow to stop the fighting.
Right.
But under a white flag of truce, the Union soldiers fired upon Forrest men.
And some of them were drunk, right? Weren't
Yeah.
some of the Union soldiers drunk during this?
The commander gave them liquor before the battle to make them brave. So it was just a debacle. Anyway you look at it, debacle.
State Park, they have that visitor center there, and they have all these displays about the USCT, United States Colored Troops, and what happened at the battle, and this and that and everything. You go through that whole visitor center there, not one time, not one exhibit in there tells you that Forrest gave them 3 chances to surrender.
That's right. Preach
and
it,
he was
brother.
turned down.
It
And
is.
so
Yep.
all they can talk about is the Fort Pillow massacre.
Yep.
Well, they never give you the facts of what actually happened to the numbers. Forrest took out over 200 prisoners.
Yep.
And there were 130 that were too seriously wounded to be moved. He left them there that night with the federal medical staff. So they didn't take them. So if it was a massacre, and a massacre is defined as a total annihilation.
Yep.
So
Right.
if Forrest ordered a massacre, he didn't do a very good job of it. When you take out 200 prisoners and leave another 130 behind.
Right.
Maybe he wasn't
But
trained
it's
at
war
West.
propaganda.
He
It's
wasn't
war
trained in West
propaganda,
Point. He didn't know how to
weapons
do
of
it.
mass destruction and all the other nonsense. Gulf of Tonkin, I got caught in that one. So, the Yankee government will lie anytime to get something across on the people.
Well, he wasn't West Point trained. He didn't actually know how to do a massacre.
No, he didn't. And it wasn't.
So, and now how many were actually killed in that battle?
There were 200, in fact, Rick can probably correct me on this. There were about 226 that were.
Yep.
And I think over 200 were taken out, and then another 130 were left behind. Anyway, the total would have to come up to 557. That was the
Right.
total number of federal troops that were at Fort Pillow.
And they were black and white. They weren't just all black. It's not like, we're not going to kill the white troops.
About half and half.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. And now there was a congressional investigation after that at the end of the war that he had to testify before, correct?
And one of the most staunch rivals of Forrest was Sherman. And so...
And Sherman said he didn't think anything had happened there.
Right.
And if anybody would want to come after Forrest or any other Southerner, it'd be Sherman.
Yep.
But he said no, it was just made up, a myth.
And so he became exonerated, and one of his greatest enemies helped to exonerate him. So.
Well, of course, maybe Sherman just didn't want things pointed in his direction in some of the things he had done, but I'll just throw that out there.
Yeah, does Scorching Georgia have anything to do with it?
If you guys read the book by, oh, good Lord, if I can remember his name, Jeffrey Adicott,
I know you speak.
Union Terror. I know there's supposed to be a second edition coming out of it, but the first one lays it out really well. So that's a good book to read about Sherman and some of the others, what they did during the Civil War. So he gets through the war, and so at the end of the war, and unless there's anything else you guys want to say about what he did during the war.
Would like to throw in one point here. We've written an article that was published in the Barnes Review, which is an absolutely great magazine. Gives you the politically incorrect version of history. And we had an article in there in the Southern issue that they put out on Forrest's strategy, if they had only listened. And it lists how many times Forrest had advised the commander on the field what to do during battles, like Rick was talking about at Fort Donelson, at Shiloh. He was ignored and we lost the battle. And then he even wrote to Richmond and suggested how they could stop Sherman, Grant, Buell, Rosecrans, and he did. He stopped every one of those armies by not fighting them head to head. He went around behind them and cut their supply lines, and he stopped them. It wasn't a theory. He proved it would work, and the Confederate government ignored him. But Forrest was respected more by the Yankee government than he was by his own government.
Correct.
Because when Sherman was in Chattanooga and getting ready to launch his campaign down the Western and Atlantic Railroad and take Atlanta, the one thing he was afraid of was Forrest getting into Tennessee and cutting the two railroads, Nashville and Decatur and Nashville and Chattanooga. And that would leave Sherman stranded in North Georgia with zero supplies coming in, because they couldn't use the Tennessee River in the summertime because of Muscle Shoals.
Yep.
You couldn't get big boats up over the shoals. So they had to use those two railroads. And so if Forrest got into Tennessee and cut those railroads, Forrest would be like Napoleon in the winter in Russia in 1812. So that they were more afraid of Forrest and respected Forrest's ability a lot more than the Confederate government did, until it was too late.
Right. Well, of course, a lot of them would have been ex-West Pointers as well, I'm sure.
No. Well, the theory was this. In Richmond, President Davis and even Robert E. Lee, they thought somehow they were going to win a major battle and destroy the Army of the Potomac and march on Washington, and the war would be over. And what they didn't realize, the North had an unlimited supply of manpower and materials. And you look at how many times Lee defeated the armies that were sent against him at Chancellorsville, at Second Manassas, at Fredericksburg, the Shenandoah Valley. They defeated all those armies, but it wasn't a big enough battle and it wasn't a big enough defeat to change the outcome of the war.
Correct.
And Forrest understood that the Confederacy just did not have the manpower to fight these monster battles. Because if we lost 5,000 and the North lost 15,000, they'd replace their 15,000 with 20,000. We'd replace our 5,000, maybe 800, 500, something like that. We couldn't fight these huge pitched battles. And Forrest understood that.
Right.
And he never fought them head to head. That's why he went around behind them and cut their supply lines.
Right.
And so he made Buell and Rosecrans and Grant and Sherman turn around and retreat back to Nashville or retreat back to Memphis.
I'm surprised Lee didn't see that. That really surprises me. It seems like he would have known that, especially as conventionally trained as he was and as much experience as he had. And of course, later on in the war, they stopped doing the prisoner exchanges.
Yeah.
The North figured out, well, look, okay, we can replace our people. They realized, well, the South can't replace theirs, so we're not going to do any more prisoner swaps.
And to add what Gene was talking about, one of the best strategies that Forrest would be known for, like at Parker's Crossroads, Bryce's Crossroads, or all the battles in between, he would always be facing a major, he's always outnumbered.
Right.
Always. And so, like at Parker's Crossroads, Bryce's, it doesn't matter, he would look at what size army he's facing, and then he would isolate them one regiment at a time, one brigade at a time, and he would go after those cells of this big group coming after him.
Right.
And so he would eliminate each little group so he didn't have to face the one big group
all at once, yeah.
All at once. And so that was his strategy, and it worked time and time and time again, where Lee and that West Point mentality was march straight in and face the enemy as a whole. And
Right.
it would be a tough battle. So Forrest learned how real quick to go and eliminate the enemy one little depot at a time. And that's the reason he'd lead these raids. And it kept the enemy off guard and off balance, because they would then send troops to the last place he raided, and they would be going, let's say, to Trenton, to the train depot there that Forrest just raided. Now Forrest is in Union City. So he moved, and he kept them off balance all the time. So he was very smart.
Now you had an ancestor that fought with Forrest.
And didn't know it for a long time, but I actually had three on the Hannah side of my family, which is my mother. 3 Hannahs rode with Forrest, and then 2 Revels rode with Forrest. So,
wow.
So they all 5 of them rode with the devil.
And there were some of Forrest's slaves at the time rode with him, and not just, they weren't there just to fix his dinner and shine his boots and take care of his horses either. They were actually part of the guard,
Let me take a little of this, and I'll pass it on to Gene in a minute. But he's known as a slave trader, and so he does have slaves in his possession when the war begins. They become first as teamsters, as cooks, but as time went on, they became his bodyguards. They would actually look after him, and they would actually try to protect him. And these men became armed and dangerous. They actually had weaponry on them. They would pick up captured weapons, and they were more well armed than some of the white counterparts in the brigades of Forrest. They watch after Forrest. There are times, it's even mentioned, some of them were with the 7th Tennessee, which reflects back to my ancestors in the 7th Tennessee. They're on the field, and James Longstreet is at the Battle of Chickamauga, and he points out and he says, who is that well-trained infantry on the field? That well-trained group of men there, who are they? And they said, that's Forrest Dismounted Cavalry. And he is actually talking about the 7th Tennessee, and in that 7th Tennessee, there are black members. There are black Confederates on the field firing weapons. And so that's one of these myths that people want to talk about that say, well, that never happened. But Forrest had them. And then after the war, some of these same men, it comes time to try to get some type of pension, a soldier's pension, and Forrest goes and stands up for these men and says, these men deserve a pension. They were with me. Right. So he tries to take care of them during the war and after the war, because they helped protect him. They looked out after him. And they all were promised, once the war is over, you fight for your freedom. It's just as we're fighting for our freedom, you fight for your freedom at the same time. And so they all got it. And it had nothing to do with an Emancipation Proclamation.
Right.
It has to do with their relationship, because a lot of these grew up with Forrest.
Right.
Gene, do you have anything that...
No, that's actually true, Rick, of course. And that's one of the 3 things they always throw against Forrest. The Fort Pillow Massacre, which we've laid that to rest. And then they said he was a slave trader. Well, okay, slavery was legal back then,
yes, sir,
before the war. And he was very careful to make sure that families did not get separated.
Yes.
And he would even go out of his way to buy back members of a family that had been separated. And another thing they'll never tell you is they let the slaves that he had, he would let them go out and pick who they wanted to work for. And then he would negotiate the price with that plantation owner or whoever. And there were certain people in the tri-state area of Tennessee, Mississippi, and Arkansas that he wouldn't sell to, because he knew they weren't going to take good care of his slaves.
That wouldn't be good masters.
And he got out of it before the war, got out of the business. It was a legal business, but there was that certain stigma about a slave dealer. Everybody wanted slaves. I mean, they were the John Deere tractor of the 1800s. But being a slave dealer, that sort of had a certain kind of a stigma about it. And he didn't want that hanging over his children. So it's kind of like today. Everybody wants to drive a Mercedes or a Lamborghini, but they really don't want to hang out with mechanics that work on it, because they've got, grease under their fingernails and everything. So that's sort of the same comparison today of what it's like.
Right.
And at the first of the war, Rick, just like you said, he called his slaves together and said, we need teamsters, we need blacksmiths, we need harness makers, we need everything that we had before the war, we need during the war. And he said, I promise you, if you serve, then I will sign your papers and you will get your freedom. And so 45 went with him.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And then about the 3rd time he'd been shot, he called them together and said, boys, I don't think I'm going to make it to the end of the war. and I promised Mrs. Forrest you would get your freedom. You're free to go now, but we need your help, and we'd certainly appreciate it if you'd stick it out with us. And 44 out of the 45 stayed with him. And just like you said, Rick, some of them were in his escort company. And back then, an escort company, a general could have an escort company, which was about 100 men. And usually it was a son-in-law or a nephew or somebody that wanted to ride around with a general and have a fancy uniform and never hear a shot fired in anger. Forrest Escorts Company was totally different. It was like Marine Reconnaissance or Navy SEALs or Special Ops. They were the ones that were thrown right into the middle of the battle to tip the scales when it was going either way. So that was a totally different operation, and blacks served in that escort company. They started out with 100, but during the course of the war, they went through over 260 members of his escort company. So because so many of them were killed or wounded and incapacitated. So that's who was serving in his escort company. And just like you said, Rick, they were like his bodyguards.
They were. And then at the Battle of Parker's Crossroads, when he had to actually charge both ways,
Right.
it was his escort that led the charge back towards Sullivan. It was like about 100 some odd men in the escort. Imagine that attacking a regiment.
Yeah.
Put that in your pipe
Wow.
and smoke it.
Wow.
That's bravery.
Absolutely.
That's bravery.
Well, and
Well, they were all young men. A lot of them were teenagers, and all of us has thought when we were teenagers we were bulletproof.
Yeah.
So that's where they
Invincible.
got those volunteers from.
well, and let's not forget on the whole slavery thing. Most of them would have been brought here on northern ships or ships built in the north, and they were bought in Africa from other blacks. Okay.
Yes.
It's not like a bunch of scurvy-ridden white guys went all across the ocean and chased down a bunch of blacks in the jungle. That's not the way it happened. We bought them from others. Terrible trade. The only good byproduct of the
terrible.
Civil War is that slavery's gone. That's the only good, but it's a byproduct.
Yeah.
Okay. It was not the reason that the North invaded.
Yeah.
And it was not the only reason that the South seceded by any means. And for this generation that thinks abortion on demand is a civil right, I don't think they can't throw any stones, in my opinion, at past generations on that issue.
Well, when the children of Israel were slaves, it was a terrible institution.
Right.
When the blacks were a slave in America, it was a terrible institution.
Yep.
But it's history.
Yep.
It's something we have to live with. But we have to know the truth, and we have to teach the truth about what took place.
Yep.
You can't do that. You can't teach the truth.
No,
You
but
have to have,
that's what we're trying to
have a
do.
villain.
Yeah.
You have to have. It's like professional wrestling. You got the good guys
And the
you
bad
got
guys.
The bad guys.
Yep.
And so you have to have a villain. So the North is not going to admit that they murdered civilians, that they robbed civilian homes, that they destroyed private property. They're never going to admit that.
Right.
So you have to have a villain to dump off all the bad things on. So that's why they use the South. And by saying that they were fighting to abolish slavery, it gives them the high ground. And the South wasn't fighting to maintain slavery. The South offered to end slavery. They said, well, do what the British did, do what the French did, the Portuguese. Pay us for the investment that we have in the slaves. North wouldn't do it. Wouldn't do it. So the real reason of the war was like every war since way back when Uglog hit Mugog over the head with a dinosaur bone out in front of the cave, it was money.
Right.
Because in the 1850s and 60s, the South had the money because the South had cotton. And cotton was back then what oil is today.
Yep.
So when the South left, Lincoln lost his money to operate the federal government. Okay. So he could not allow the South to leave. Lincoln said the seven states that had seceded, they can stay out of the Union, they can keep the slaves, which wasn't important to us, but it was to them. You can stay out of the Union and keep your slaves if you pay your taxes to the U.S. government.
Yep.
And we're going, wait a minute. We have to pay taxes to a foreign country? I don't think we're going to do that.
Yep. Well, and
so Lincoln admitted it wasn't about slavery; it's about money.
Yeah. Well, and they certainly didn't want another country to the south of them with ports that were not going to be charging as high of a tariff as they charged. That's a competition they definitely did not want.
And
sir, didn't want that at all.
And one quick thing to always keep in mind: we didn't have to have the war.
Right.
Now let me explain briefly. The South did not have the votes. If the North at any time wanted to say slavery is now illegal, They had the Senate. They had every branch sewn up. Anytime they wanted to have a vote, they could have legally done away with it, with votes in the House, the Senate, and the president signing off on it. I think Buchanan would have probably signed off on it. So you had the ability to never have a war had they wanted to vote on it. But it was about the money.
Right.
Yep.
It was about the money.
The North, ask people that say it's about slavery, ask them what was the first 13th Amendment that was passed by the U.S. Congress. The first 13th Amendment protected slavery in the Constitution.
Yep.
And it was the Corrin Amendment. Representative Corrin from Ohio, they passed an amendment to protect slavery, to lure those 7 states back into the Union. Yep. And it passed in the U.S. Congress. Yep. 4 states in the North passed it. If those 7 states had come back in, it would have been protected in the Constitution. Yep. But the Southern states said that wasn't why we left. Yep. Why would we come back on that? So in the Congress, and President Lincoln said he would sign it. If Congress passed it, he would sign that 13th Amendment that would protect slavery in the U.S. Constitution. Yep. But that was the reason of the war, just like you said, Rick, both of y'all.
Yep.
And let's not forget that Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, and Arkansas, those first 3 especially being pertinent to when you look at the Civil War as far as numbers and leadership, they didn't come in until after Sumter. After Sumter and after Lincoln called up for all those volunteers to go invade that's when they said, no, we're not doing this.
Right.
So I really can't imagine much of a civil. I'm not knocking the people in the Deep South, but if you took away the troops from Virginia, the troops from North Carolina, and the troops from Tennessee, and then the leadership from especially Virginia and Tennessee, it would have been a whole different ball game. Okay, so that's on Lincoln. That's on Lincoln. He totally miscalculated what would happen when he called up for 75,000 volunteers, how that would be taken. Anyway, okay, so I want to get to one last thing.
Yes.
Not one last thing, but one of the big smears against Forrest is, well, he was the first Grand Wizard of the Klan. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Nope, another lie. I know this is shocking to our viewers out there. The federal government in Washington will lie to you. And not only that, but the lamestream media will back it up. And no, Forrest did not start the Klan. It started down in Pulaski, Tennessee in December of 1865, and there were 6 former Confederate soldiers that started it. And it was not a political organization. It was like a soldiers organization, like the American Legion of the VFW. Now, they get mad when I say that, but I said, no, the original Klan was not a political organization.
Yeah. Not what it evolved into.
It was just like a fraternity or, whatever. And it turned into a vigilante group to protect people after the Reconstruction government got so bad. Mm-hmm. And the reason they needed it was just like the federal troops coming out of Fort Pillow. After the war, the Southern Army surrendered. And they thought they could trust the Northern government to say, if you surrender and do not take up arms against the United States government, you will become citizens of the United States again. And we believed it. Unfortunately, we believed it. And so once the armies were disbanded and disarmed, then they turned loose the Reconstruction government and went after parts of the South that were not even affected by the war.
Martial law, that's what it was under martial law.
Right.
Yeah, under martial law. They passed the Franchise Act where Southerners couldn't vote, so you couldn't elect a sheriff or a tax assessor. So that's where a lot of these Northern billionaires, like the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers and Carnegies, they came down here and bought up land, stole it for pennies on the dollar. And you couldn't have a sheriff, so you couldn't protect yourself. So it wasn't just the Klan. There were self-protection groups all over the South. The Red Shirts in South Carolina, Texas and Louisiana, it was the Knights of the White Camellia. In southern Middle Tennessee and northern Alabama, the Klan turned from this fraternity or just soldiers organization into a political organization to try to protect people.
And let's not forget the Union
did not start it. Like I said, they used to have a plaque on the law office in Pulaski with the 6 names of the Confederates that started it, and Forrest's name was not on that.
Right.
And I always ask these critics, well, how could he start the Klan if he were living in Memphis and it started in Pulaski. Which is, 300 or 400 miles away? And don't tell me he used Spotted Al Gore's internet that he claimed he invented to start the Klan from Memphis all the way over to Pulaski. So, and he was not the grand wizard of it. That was former General George Gordon.
Right.
And there's a letter in the library at the in Cumberland University in Lebanon from his wife saying that her husband was the grand wizard of the Klan. And it doesn't make any sense. Who was the most well-known person in Tennessee after the war? Bedford Forrest. So if they were trying to figure out who was head of this secret organization, he would have been the first one they went after. He may have been a member, as most men were, to protect their families, but he certainly wasn't head of it.
Two things on that real quick, and then have you follow up. You never hear about the Union Leagues, which were during Reconstruction South. You never hear about what the Union, all the things you hear the Klan did. The Union Leagues were doing those to former Confederates, to civilians during that time. All the kind of same terror tactics that you hear attributed, they were doing that, okay? And that was from the Union side, but you never hear about the Union Leagues. And I think there was another group, and I can't recall the name of it. They did the same kind of things, but you don't hear that. And then the other thing is that just like with the Fort Pillow massacre, he was questioned by Congress about his involvement with the Klan. And I think he did admit a little bit of a relationship, but once the Klan kind of went off the rails, he basically
ask it to be disbanded.
Yeah, that's my understanding. From what I've read, this is congressional record. This is not Dave's record at home. This is congressional record.
To kind of add to it, in some writings, S.D. Lee is one of the reasons we have the Sons of Confederate Veterans. He also got with a group of people in New Orleans, and they got together to collect writings of Southern individuals. John Morton was one of the individuals that, in some of his writings, he was talking about that subject, and he says at Maxwell House Hotel in Nashville, Tennessee, he invited Forrest to join him there. Forrest was in town on railroad business. At this time, he's an entrepreneur. He's trying to get railroads built and reestablished so the economy can flourish again. So that was Forrest's main mission, was to get his business reestablished and get the rail lines back up and going. So that was his vision, not to start a Klan or anything like that. While he's in Nashville, John Morton asked him to go to the Maxwell House Hotel to meet some of these individuals from Pulaski that's putting this group together. Forrest turns it down. He says, I don't want to be a part of this. I'm too busy. So this is early on, and this is something John Morton talks about. So here's somebody that, as a witness, it says he turns it down. So somewhere, if he does get involved, it's going to come after this Maxwell House Hotel meeting. Here's a quick history about Maxwell House. Maxwell House Hotel, built by a rich person living in Nashville for his wife. It's to be something that he's giving to his wife. But during the war, did you realize it was a prison?
No, I didn't know that.
Yes. The Union Army, when they took over Nashville, it became a prison. And they housed Confederate prisoners in there. And after the Battle of Chickamauga, a lot of the captured Confederates were stored in the Maxwell House Hotel. And one morning, when they were going for breakfast, when mess call was called for breakfast, they were going down the stairwell, and the stairwell collapsed and killed 300 prisoners. Oh, Have you ever heard that news?
No, never heard about that.
Oh, the Union Army didn't tell you about that?
No, never heard about that. No.
Yeah, that's history. That's written history.
Wow.
So, Maxwell House Hotel.
Gene, you got anything else on that?
No, another thing they don't tell you about either. That was the old Maxwell House downtown at 5th and Church or 4th and Church down there in Nashville. After that stairwell collapsed, people outside could hear these people screaming.
Yes.
I mean, you had 3 or 4 stories of wood and steps and everything come down on you and crush you, broken legs, broken arms. The federal soldiers wouldn't help the Confederates out until they put guards around the outside and kept civilians from coming in and trying to get these timbers and things off of these men and get them out of there and get them to a hospital. So yeah, the federal soldiers were involved, but they wanted to make sure that nobody helped these people that were being crushed by all of this wood that collapsed on them.
Wow. What kind of relationship did Forrest have with blacks in Memphis or in the state in general after the war?
He hired blacks to work on that Memphis, Marion, and Selma Railroad that Rick had talked about they were trying to build after the war. And not only did he hire blacks, he paid them the same wages that he was paying the white workers. And that really caused a problem because people were saying, you can't do that. You can't pay them the same thing you're paying the white workers. And he said, I sure can. They're doing the same work. They're going to get the same money. And then they try to paint Forrest as some kind of devil with horns and everything about his relationship with the blacks. He was invited after the war to speak to the Ancient Order of Pole Bearers. Mm-hmm. And this was the forerunner of the NAACP. And he was the keynote address for this organization that met in Memphis. And if he were such a horrible person, why would they invite him to come and speak to their organization? Because this is after the war. They were not slaves. The war was over. Slavery had ended. And they had no reason to invite a white person, anybody, especially Forrest, to come and speak to their organization.
And it said that he...
Oh, go ahead, Rick. I'm sorry.
And it said that he actually exchanged a kiss with a young lady, a kiss to the cheek with a young lady there on the stage while he's being introduced.
She gave him a bouquet of flowers.
Yes.
And thanks, he bent down and kissed her on the cheek.
Yeah, and so
that raised a stink among the whites in Memphis too. But he thought it was a courteous thing to do.
He did. He tried to be a gentleman.
This black organization, this young girl came up and gave him a bouquet of flowers, and he just bent down and kissed her on the cheek. Thank you. Thanked her. Thanked the pole bearers and everything. So, to say that he had it in for blacks the rest of his life is another lie that's told about Forrest and has come down to us as so-called history. But the winners write the history books.
And some of those...
they're going to vilify the South, vilify Lee, vilify Forrest, and tear down the monuments of all these Southern leaders and rename the military bases. And what they don't tell you on that deal is that every one of those military bases was named after a Southerner that fought for the U.S. Army, either in Mexico or in the Indian Wars.
That's correct.
It was not just people that they grabbed names out of the South, but they had served in the U.S. military. But now they don't want those names on Fort Bragg or Fort Polk, Fort Jackson, anything like that. And then tore down the Reconciliation Monument in Arlington Cemetery that was put up in 1914 to show that the North and South had come back together again. And that was proposed by Northern presidents that had served in the Union Army during the war. Mm-hmm. So if they don't want to reconciliate, fine. We didn't want to be a part of their country in 1861. As far as I'm concerned, we don't want to be a part of it in 2024 either. They don't want to reconciliate.
And some of those people that was at the pole bearers meeting that day at Forrest's funeral, they would attend.
Right.
So there was black people that lined the street there watching the funeral procession and were weeping. They weren't cheering, they were weeping. Some of these people had worked for Forrest on the rail lines. They had worked at Mud Island. There was a time at Mud Island, if you're familiar where Mud Island is in Memphis area, there used to be a little fun park set up there, but Mud Island's, as you're crossing the river, to the left you see Mud Island, to the right you can see the pyramid as you're crossing the bridge there in Memphis. And Mud Island, at one time, he set up a farm there, a work farm, so the whites and the blacks both could work at that farm. Same thing that Gene had mentioned. They were all working for the same wages, but it was kind of like what we did in the 20s when Franklin comes up with this work relief program. Forrest, that many years ahead, was trying to come up with a way to get people to work. So they needed food, so what else to do?
Right.
So they put together basically a community farm, and these people would go in, and he was trying to figure out ways to get people paid and raise food at the same time. So that's one of the lesser known things that Forrest did after the war that has been turned around and said, oh, he's just trying to re-enslave people again. That's how they try to turn it around today.
Well, now, if I remember correct from reading one of the books about him, it wasn't just maybe some of the local whites that resented how much he was paying them, but the Freedmen's Bureau had an issue with it as well. If I remember, do you know anything about that, Gene?
No, but the whole problem with that was Forrest paying the blacks the same wages he was paying the whites destroyed their myth of this evil person. And so the facts be damned. They don't want to hear facts. All they want is to continue this myth of this devil with horns and so forth, of how evil the South was to the blacks after the war.
Right.
And what they can't understand is we'd grown up with blacks our whole lives. I mean, these boys had played together before the war. They farmed together. They worked together. And war came along. Blacks and whites joined the Confederate Army. Point I like to make, and this irritates them again, is that the Confederate Army was integrated in 1861. The U.S. Army wasn't integrated till Harry Truman in 1948.
Right.
So blacks and whites served together in Confederate. Now, there were more blacks that served in the U.S. Army because they had more recruits in the USCTs, and there were more whites in the U.S. Army than there were in the Confederate Army. There's just the difference in numbers.
Right.
But that's something they don't want to hear either.
I want to point out one thing, too. A lot of people wonder, how could Forrest make a transition? During the war, one of the things that Forrest would require you to do, if you were sitting in a staff meeting or something and you said a curse word, or if you even said a cursed word before the battle begins around him, he might smack you and tell you not to say a curse word. He was known to say a few curse words himself. But he tried to have discipline amongst his men. But he was still known to be a pretty rough character, rough around the edges. But there was something that happened to him, and there's a portrait that we sent about Mary where he meets Mary. And it's kind of a damsel in distress story where she's crossing a creek. This is before the war. She's crossing a creek, I believe, with her mother, and a rock breaks the spoke in the buggy wheel, so they're stranded in the midst of the creek. Forrest comes along, carries her to the shore. That's how he meets her. They begin to court. They get married, but he's still a pretty rough cob during the war. After the war, he becomes a Christian.
Right.
There is, in the church where they attended, they put his name on a little placard on the bench where he attended. So I think his heart after the war began to change even more so. Before the war, he was very equal to how he treated people.
Right.
You know, I think he would never offered his slaves to become part of the escort and to be treated as equals on the battlefield and in camp. But after the war, when he became a Christian, that's when I start seeing a lot of changes in him. Right. And he became far more benevolent. So a lot of things he did about paying everybody equal wages and starting the railroad and trying to employ. So one of the first people he employed, believe it or not, was a Yankee. Right after the surrender in Alabama, they come back to Memphis, and a Yankee lieutenant follows him back to the Hernando area and is going to go in. He likes the idea of starting these railroads, so he actually goes to work with Forrest.
Wow.
So that's how mesmerizing this man was. When he spoke, people listened.
Right.
And so,
well before E.F. Hutton.
Yeah, well before. And so if you have a Yankee soldier, a lieutenant, following you back to your home like a little puppy saying, I want to be a part of what you're going to do, that says a lot for the man. To me.
Yeah.
It says a lot for Forrest. It really does.
That's surprising to hear that. Wow.
I'd like to bring up one thing that Rick mentioned, and I've heard other people say this too, that Forrest became a Christian after the war. Well, he was not anti-Christian during the war.
That's correct.
He didn't belong to a specific church, but he wasn't an atheist. And some of his most trusted officers were ministers.
Yes,
like D.C.
a Methodist
Kelly,
minister, yes.
Methodist minister, Major D.C. Kelly.
Yes.
And he was one of his most trusted aides early in the war, and D.C. Kelly was the one that set up the artillery on the Cumberland River west of Nashville and shut down the Cumberland River coming into Nashville for 2 weeks before the Battle of Nashville. And so Forrest, maybe he wasn't an official member of a particular church, but he certainly wasn't anti-Christian. And he wasn't for the chaplains. They were always invited to eat with him and his officers at his officers' mess. So chaplains were always welcome. Mm-hmm. And that funny story they have about him after one of the battles, they'd captured a number of Union prisoners. They were being marched to the rear, and Forrest noticed that one of them was a chaplain. And he told one of the guards, that man right there, bring him out of the line. And this fellow was escorted out of the line of prisoners and brought over to Forrest. And this chaplain was literally sweating blood because he'd heard all these stories about Forrest. and he expected this two-headed monster in a Confederate uniform to just rip his head off and destroy him. And Forrest told him, so, well, preacher, we'll get you back to the enemy, to the federal lines as soon as we can. He said, we can't do it right now. There's still a lot of bullets flying around out there. It's not safe, but we will turn you back over as soon as the battle is ended. And this chaplain thanked him profusely. He never expected anything like that from somebody like Forrest, according to his reputation. And he said, well, sir, I cannot say how grateful I am that I didn't expect that. I'm so grateful, so thankful. And Forrest said, oh, no, sir, we're going to send you back over there. The Yankees need you over there a lot more than we need you over here. So that was his returning the chaplain to the federal lines.
Yeah, and even at Fort Donelson, where Forrest is sitting there up on the inside the fort, and he's looking down as the gunboats are firing toward the river battery, Confederate river battery. They're exchanging fire, what they call the Iron Valentines, and he called them turtles. He looked at the big iron turtles out in the river, and as one of the gunboats fire, it shoots over their head and hits one of the shanties, one of the huts where the Confederates lived. Hit it and explodes, and that's when Forrest looks over at the major and says, Parsons, you better pray for us. So he was very active with like Gene said, they were always a part of his life. So even during the war, he had Christian background. I'm sure his mother made sure he had a Christian background.
No doubt. And of course, now we're to the point where he's been slandered all this time, and it's only got worse since all this woke garbage started in the last 10 years or so. And so they basically desecrated his grave in Memphis, moved him to Chapel Hill, and of course, in our state capitol, a bust of Forrest, which was given to our state by the SCV, as I understand it, back in I think the 70s. Oh, well, they had to get rid of that. They had to move that. And I think it's disgraceful that the governor of our state, who, when he was running, wanted to remind everybody he was a seventh generation Tennessean. Well, I'll tell you what, those 6 generations failed to teach him some history, and failed to teach him to stand up for what's right, obviously, because he allowed that to be. I understand it was done through a committee, okay, I got it. He's the one that appointed that committee. And I think it's disgraceful.
Who appointed the committee?
That's right, the governor did. So I think it's disgraceful that somebody who should be revered, respected, and learned about by all of our kids has been treated that way.
Well, let me tell you the importance of a show like this. The education aspect of it, and what Gene's trying to do, what I'm trying to do, is not to convince you that Forrest or any of the people that fought for the Confederacy were just, they were so sweet, and you shouldn't say these things about them. It's as if I had never met Dave Vance, and I had somebody whispering in my ear, Dave Vance is terrible. He's this, he's that, and I've never met you, but they've convinced me you're a terrible person. Then after I meet you, I go, well, dang, they were wrong.
Well, some of that might be right.
But you know what I'm saying.
I got you.
You listen to somebody, they get your ear, and they fill it full, and all you think is, this person's got to be terrible. But then after you meet that person, it's like, well, they weren't that bad. It's like, dang, I kind of like him. I like what he has to say. And I think that's the way it is with a lot of history today. We've been misinformed time and time and time again. They do not teach American history anymore in school. They teach what they want to teach. It's a propaganda that gets us to think their way. And so people like Forrest become the evil boogeyman. And it becomes easy. And if you've never studied anything about Forrest, like Gene has or anybody else in the Southern movement, once you start reading about it, you go, well, they weren't that bad. But nobody's perfect.
I'll tell you what, Rick and Dave, people do not want to admit they were wrong.
There you go.
An ancient individual at 78 like I am, you don't want to admit that for 60 years out of that 78, you believed a lot of propaganda and just plain garbage. And so a lot of people don't want to admit that they've learned wrong history or the wrong idea about the South or about the Southern leaders or about the military leaders. They just don't want to admit that they've been bamboozled and lied to and believed all this propaganda, and they can't accept the truth. It's like Jack Nicholson said in A Few Good Men, you can't handle the truth.
You can't handle the truth.
They can't.
And that's true. I think you're onto something there. Any closing thoughts on Forrest, and then we're going to talk a little bit about Emancipation Proclamation.
My only thing is read. Don't take somebody's word for it. Read, and read the proper material, not...
Yeah, suggested books and suggested documents that...
The last guy that wrote on Fielding Hearst wrote a book about Forrest and Hearst both. What's Robert?
Jack Hearst. It's Jack Hearst that had that book on
Yeah,
Forrest.
Jack Hearst, he is actually a descendant of, and he
Yeah.
writes some really good stuff. So I would recommend that book too, because he covers Hearst, but he covers Forrest, and it gives you a good idea of...
Now, this is the descendant of the Hearst,
Yeah.
who was...
And he wrote a book called Hearst Worst.
Oh, okay.
Hearst Worst.
Yeah.
And he reveals his ancestor was pretty bad guy. So bad that in Bolivar, he heard a man playing the piano, and he actually was a piano teacher teaching a student how to play the piano, and the piano was slightly out of tune, and the student was not playing it correctly. And so Hearst rode up on the porch, kicked the door in, rode into the house, and shot the piano teacher because the student was playing something that Hearst didn't like to hear.
That's a psycho. I mean, we used to have places to put those kind of people. Wow.
That's who Forrest was against. He had to fight against people like that.
Good Lord.
Interesting.
Wow. Wow. You want to add anything there, Gene?
Oh, you can't top that story. That's once again, that's why Forrest was going to Fort Pillow. They thought that Hearst might be there, and they were going to try to get him and get him out of West Tennessee. But he'd already left the night before and took a steamboat down to Memphis, so he wasn't there, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Right. So today is Juneteenth, and they celebrate that, and it really originally was a Galveston, Texas issue, I think, in 1865, June of 1865, they said, oh, well, Lincoln did the Emancipation Proclamation back in 1862, 63. Initial announcement, I think, was September of 62, and then became effective in January of 63, and now you guys are all free. And, of course, now it's a national holiday. We won't get into all that, but let's just talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. It didn't really, there's a whole lot of people that didn't apply to. I mean, a lot of people read Emancipation Proclamation and they hear about Lincoln the Great Emancipator, but there were some exceptions, notable exceptions in that declaration there. Let's talk about that just a little bit.
It's called the Mason-Dixon line. Everything south of it affected everything north of it, didn't it?
Was not an act of Congress. It was an executive order.
Yep.
And it didn't apply to any part of the country except the area of the country where Lincoln had no power.
Right.
So it would have been just like President Trump issuing a proclamation that regarded communist China. And they look at that proclamation in communist China and say, you go away, Yellow Hair, it doesn't apply over here. No, you go away, you bad guy. So that's what it was. And it was just for political purposes only. It was written and issued to try to keep England and France out of the war on the side of the Confederates.
It was a strategy.
And once they issued this proclamation that said the U.S. government was fighting against slavery, then that automatically threw the onus on the South and said, well, they must be fighting for it. So England and France bailed out on trying to help the South. And, if they had, it'd probably been the same result as the first war for independence. When France came in and helped the colonies, they defeated the British. So the Emancipation had no intent to really free the slaves, and that didn't happen until the 13th Amendment was passed in 1865. But it made the Yankee government look like they were the good guys and fighting for something that they really weren't. So like y'all were mentioning it, it only applied to those states in rebellion against the U.S. government, which meant Confederacy, where Lincoln had no power. And not only that, it just like you said, Dave, it exempted parts of the South that were occupied by the U.S. Army.
Yep.
And that's one thing I never could figure out. I mean, that seems like that would be the most simple place to enforce it.
Right.
But the sneaky reason behind it, and I know our viewers are going to say, the U.S. government was sneaky again. If they were not free, they were contraband of war. So the Yankee Army could come in and take the slaves from a southern plantation and used the slaves as contraband of war to dig the latrines, to clean up after the horses and mules, do all the nasty jobs that the white Yankee soldiers didn't want to do. Yeah. And it even listed in the Emancipation, and we need to get people to actually read what it actually said, it even listed the parishes in Louisiana where it didn't apply. So it was just another, dog and pony show that Lincoln came up with to make the Yankee government look good and throw the onus on the South that they were the bad guys, and they were out there fighting for slaves, and that's the reason they lost the war. They were just sitting on the front porch sipping mint juleps and beating the slaves with the other hand. So,
and it was those plantations in Louisiana that was providing sugar and rice that the North was needing, and that's part of the reason they were left out. So once again, it's money.
Well,
the money.
And some of those big plantations, especially in Louisiana, were black owned, right?
In the city of New Orleans alone, there were 700 black individuals that owned slaves, and one of the largest plantations that had over 300, Benjamin Butler went in and shut it down and burned it to the ground, and it was owned by blacks. And so, once again, if it's to free the blacks, if it's to better them, why go in and burn their plantation? It was a sugar plantation.
Yeah. And of course, without those exceptions, it might have been an embarrassment. And I think you told me the story about when Grant's wife came down to Vicksburg. Who she brought with them?
Brought 3 with her, and before the war, Grant actually is a foreman on his father-in-law's farm or plantation, and he's over 35 slaves as the foreman. So I think that may be a reason he said, if the war is over slavery, I will not lend my sword to the war, and go to the other side.
And Mrs. Grant came up with one of the best quotes of the war. Some newspaper reporter asked her, well, ma'am, since Lincoln has passed this emancipation to free the slaves, why do you still have your slaves? And her line was, well, good help is so hard to find.
Yeah.
There you go.
And the state of Delaware, which supplied troops to the Union Army,
right?
Slavery is in full function in Delaware.
Yeah.
And Maryland, which is kind of a neutral state, is that in-between state.
Well, they were forced to be neutral.
They were forced to be neutral. But you have those states that were considered to be Union states that had slaves still, that the Emancipation Proclamation didn't affect. The last state to own their state constitution to make it illegal to own slaves was New Jersey.
Oh, wow.
After the war is over, the last state to nullify it in their constitution was the state of New Jersey.
Wow. Well, I wish we had more time because I'd like to get into the fact that, okay, by December of 1865, the 13th Amendment had passed, and then by 1866, when you get the radical Republicans in, and now in order for the states to be let back in,
right,
that were told that it wasn't possible they were told it wasn't possible to secede, you've got to pass the 14th Amendment. So how can you vote for an amendment if you're not a state? So, but that's maybe we can get to that next time, because there's a lot of hypocrisy there too.
Yeah. Oh,
so and it's like they kept moving the goalpost and changing what it took to be integrated back into the country.
That's the Reconstruction years.
Yeah.
Oh, buddy, it was tough.
Yeah.
Tennessee was a tough state to live in at that
Absolutely.
time, buddy.
Well, hey, thank you both for joining. I appreciate all that you guys do, and I want to thank everybody that took the time to watch the program today. Please be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons, as well as the notification bell, so you never miss a show. The Tennessee Informer is also available to listen to as an audio podcast on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Spreaker, and other popular podcast platforms. You can find them on our website at TennesseeInformer.com. While you're there, please sign up for our weekly newsletter to stay up to date. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Just search for @TNInformer. Share us with your friends. Next Monday, 7 p.m., our guest will be Representative Chris Todd, and on Tuesday, our guest will be Representative Jody Barrett. Hope you'll join us then. That's all for now. Good day from Paris, Tennessee, that is.
Yeah, that was a good good one, Gene. You did excellent. Thank
Hey,
you,
you
sir.
guys, please share this. Get this out on your